I had done something or made a noise or said something, and he kind of looked at me and laughed, and he said, well, at least you don't have Tourette's. And I kind of looked at him. I said, actually...
Hey, it's Ben. You're listening to the Tourette's podcast, and this is going to be an awesome episode. The proof is right ahead. If this is your first time listening, and I say this because I keep hearing from new listeners, this is a podcast where I, being someone in his late 30s with Tourette syndrome who was closeted and shameful about it until roughly late 2017, this is already a long sentence, this is where I talk to somebody else out there in the world who also has Tourette syndrome. And we collectively, as listeners, find takeaways and strange things in common, and ultimately a dismissal of that feeling of isolation or underrepresentation. And that's a lot to discuss, which is why I'm going to give a huge shout out right now to someone who I guess you could say is the first real professional associate of the Tourette's podcast. And that's Sophia in the UK, who will be the admin to the brand new, just launched, I'm going to put an asterisk on this, just launched Tourette's podcast discussion group on Facebook. I know I've been talking about that for too long now, but thanks to Sophia, it's happening. As far as I know, I had to set up a personal Facebook account to start this discussion group. I just haven't been a Facebook user, so I set up an account, but then Facebook disabled the account because they seem to think that I'm not a real person. So I've filed a couple appeals with them. The good thing is I was a user long enough to create the discussion group and then make Sophia the admin. So in theory, it's good to go now and all of you can join, and I really hope you do. If this apparent Facebook ban on me sticks, and that impacts the validity of the discussion group somehow, then we'll try again. But last I heard, this thing was good to go, so come on in. Though I should say this is a closed Facebook group, meaning you're going to have to request permission to join. And that's just to keep things, focused and make sure the group is a sincere group of people participating. But don't let that throw you. All you have to do is request permission to join the Facebook group and answer 3 questions, quick and easy questions, and then you'll be in business. And this is going to be a great place to weigh in on things that you've heard on the podcast. Opinions, keep them friendly, of course, but opinions, observations, eureka moments, responses to questions that we put out there. Tourette's podcast discussion group on Facebook. Sophia is at the helm, and we're going to hear from her on this podcast before long too, I'm pretty sure. So I'm excited about all this. Let me know if you have any questions, and of course you can always still send me an email, tourettespodcast@gmail.com. Speaking of which, we have some new entries to the listener mailbag. One I just got here is actually really cool. This comes from Victoria out of Arizona. Victoria's alerted me to an ebook that she's working on. It's a dessert recipe book for people with Tourette syndrome. And I'm going to check this out after I get done with this episode and bring out more information in the future about this ebook as it becomes known to me. It sounds amazing. And I guess it's a question we should put out there just for the sake of my own research and edification. Do any of you have higher occurrences of tics in correlation with certain foods that you eat? Like, do you think there's a food that somehow sets you off and inflames your tics and really kind of gets you going? Tourette'sPodcast@gmail.com or try the discussion group. Again, Tourette's Podcast discussion group on Facebook. Gotta say, for having lived with Tourette syndrome for all my life, there's just so much I've yet to learn or yet to seek out when it comes to the science of Tourette syndrome and where we are with it. What's working in terms of treatment, of which I currently receive none, outside my therapeutic conversations with you guys. Thank you. And oh, by the way, so Christine Canalia, a scientist we heard from a couple episodes back, I think back in episode 0 of this season, she was asking about, what research I wanted to see, and I told her I'd love to see some science on the benefits of having TS. Like, what's unique to TS that could be seen as a plus? Like, what do we have that nobody else has? And she told me a few days ago, quote, procedural memory is enhanced in TS. This system helps you learn and remember motor skills like playing an instrument or swinging a tennis racket. TS is the only condition that's ever shown this advantage. End quote. And she tweeted out a link to the research on this, which I'll include in the show notes at tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. Christine, thank you so much. So for all you parents who write me asking what to expect from your child's diagnosis, enhanced procedural memory. Okay, one more piece from the listener mailbag, and then we will migrate toward the main part of the episode. This one comes from someone, we'll just call her Jill. Not her real name, but she did write to me responding to Mike from episode 0, who had the question about when and whether to tell his young son about his Tourette diagnosis. Jill said, I just want to respond to Mike's concern about letting his son know he has Tourette's. This summer, we finally decided to tell our son about his diagnosis, and we are confident that this was the right step for us. One of the major revelations for him was that he is not alone, and that children and adults all over the world are experiencing the same feelings as he is. With the help of a friend who is a special education teacher, I'm writing a book for him to provide information and to serve as a source of comfort. Within this book, I explain what Tourette's is, what it means for him, identify celebrities, identify teens who advocate for Tourette awareness, and provide a source of happy thoughts for him to reflect upon when things get rough. I have not yet given him this book, but feel it communicates awareness, community, love, support, and comfort. She goes on to say, just my 2 cents on another approach to explaining Tourette's and other diagnoses to children. Thanks to my very inspirational friend who has been facing her own challenges with her daughter over the last few years, I hope this helps your community of readers. I'm available for further questions should anyone be interested in doing something similar for their children. Well, thanks. That is an awesome idea, creating a book, kind of a guidebook for your son or daughter to kind of walk them through the basics and I guess ideally leave it open-ended enough to where he or she can still kind of, choose your own adventure, so to speak. And one other thing real quick regarding the sort of science and me kind of wanting to know more about the neurological disorder I've lived with. I was kind of downing the idea of Botox for Tourette syndrome in previous episodes, and that's just because I didn't really know where we were on that, whether that was a legitimate treatment, or I think that's still kind of maybe sort of up in the air a bit. But I have talked with a number of people who have Tourette syndrome who have tried Botox for, certain physical twitches and some positive things to report. Again, this is all anecdotal. I've always been kind of a skeptical person by nature, I guess. And when I hear about unconventional treatments or things that sound unconventional to me, I might too quickly kind of rush to judgment on whether it's valid, and who am I to say? So if any of you out there have had positive experiences with Botox as a treatment for your, muscular tics and so on, let me know. And if it hasn't gone well for you, let me know that too. Okay, so last episode we heard from someone named Jade, who had really great feedback to questions we put out there from listeners. And this episode, we've got Jade. She's going to be our conversation this week. I don't think I need to do any more setup here. Let's just get right to it. Here's me and Jade. Okay, so introduce yourself. Just, tell us your name and the general part of the world you live in, if you're comfortable saying what your rough age bracket is, and just kind of who you are.
Sure. So my name is Jade. I live in Western Canada, more specifically St. Albert, Alberta, which is a little community just outside of Edmonton, Alberta. It's fairly small, and I'm 42, and I have 2 cats, I have a wife, and I feel very lucky. I've got a pretty good life.
Nice.
Yeah.
Are you kind of native to the area where you're living? Or?
I am. I actually was born in Edmonton, and I lived here until I was about 16, and then I moved out to a very tiny town in Manitoba. And then from there, I moved to Toronto, Ontario. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I came back to Edmonton. And then about a year ago, we moved out to St. Albert.
Okay. It's kind of funny. I incidentally have interviewed a lot of people, including somebody last night from the Toronto area, or at least, people who have some sort of, trajectory that is crossed Toronto at some point. Do you interact with other people who have Tourette syndrome in that general area? Or?
So I don't actually interact with anyone locally. It seems like, from what I've investigated, most of the Tourette support here in Edmonton and area typically are geared toward children and their families. So, it doesn't seem that there's a lot of kind of group stuff geared toward adults with Tourette syndrome. But I have joined a couple of different communities on the internet where I'm able to kind of interact with people there. And that seems to be pretty well. The moderators are very careful to make sure that everybody's behaving themselves. And so it's been mostly a positive experience there. It's I think that the one downside is, of course, there are a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings around Tourette syndrome, what it is, what it looks like, how it, happens to be in somebody's body and all of those kind of things. So I think for me, kind of seeing those misinformation and, just kind of, it's tough to see other people with Tourette syndrome who, their families are being abusive to them or not understanding, or to see, people that believe it's a mental illness, that it looks one way and not the other, it's been talked about quite a bit in the communities, as well as, on your podcast about, the misconception that if you have Tourette syndrome, you have to have, where you're yelling or swearing or doing all the vocal and, but people need to understand that it presents in so many different ways, and there are so many comorbids that go along with it. So while we do all have many similarities, we also kind of have our own journey to walk, because when you throw the comorbids in on top of it, then you have a whole nother ballgame.
Absolutely. And I kind of want to get your context and sort of what your backstory is with Tourette syndrome. I mean, at what age did you start to exhibit tics, and, just how did that all transpire?
Yeah, so I was pretty young when I first noticed. So first thing I'll say is I have dyscalculia, so my timelines might be a little bit inconsistent. But I was very young.
And explain what that is real quick, just in case anybody doesn't know.
Yeah, so dyscalculia is similar in some ways to dyslexia. The way that my brain parses numbers, directions, spatial recognition, all of that kind of stuff is just a little bit muddy. So when somebody asks me a timeline, for example, my brain might tell me it had only been 3 months, but maybe it was 6 months, or, and growing up, I remember I could not tell time on a normal clock until I was like 15, because I couldn't understand why with money, a quarter is 25, but with a clock, it's 15. And this was my nightmare, essentially, until I was about 15 years old.
Wow.
And dyscalculia is also a lot of the time people can't. So if they're trying to drive somewhere, for example, wayfinding can be really complicated. So anybody out there that maybe has trouble reading maps or following street signs or that kind of stuff, of course, we all adapt. One of my adaptions has been to use landmarks instead of street signs and numbers. So basically, I'll look something up ahead of time, so I have a rough idea of where I'm going. And now with the amazing thing that Google Map does, you can do the street view, so you can look for landmarks. So I know, for example, when I'm going to this place, I need to turn left at the 7-Eleven and da-da-da-da-da. Right? So that is a much easier way to kind of parse information if you have dyscalculia. So apologies if my timelines are a little bit wonky. So I first noticed my tics when I was really young. I remember sitting in the gymnasium with all the kids eating lunch. So we're talking really young. And I would pop my shoulder out of place. That was the first tic that I was aware of. And the reason I was aware of it is because when I would do it, first of all, it would hurt. But then my shoulder blade in the back would stick up really noticeably. So the kids sitting around me would scream because they like it would freak them out. They didn't understand what I was doing. It just looked really freaky. So that's my first memory. And my mom did take me to the doctor at that time. And, back then, so 40 years ago-ish, things like Tourette syndrome, they weren't really known. Things have definitely changed. And the doctor basically told my mother that it was just a phase. I was just popping my arm out of place, not a big deal. So there was no really aha moment in that regard. And then, as time went on, I started doing more tics, like facial. I do a lot of different movements with my face, my nose. I squish my eyes shut while rolling them backward, sniffing, throat clearing, repeating things, reading things out loud, talking to myself. I also vocalize my pain a lot, which is kind of funny. I have a lot of chronic pain from other things. And so one of my tics is actually to verbalize my pain. So it's been an interesting learning curve because, people around me are like, well, what else hurts? Oh, okay. Well, but it's something I can't control, right? Like it's almost like my brain is doing like a little like steam release, like it can't contain the pain levels. And then I vocalize it. And it's not that I'm looking for attention or any of that kind of stuff. They'll be like, oh man, yeah. Oh, my foot hurts. Oh, and it just happens. And, afterward, then like if somebody brings my attention to it, that I've done it. So when I first got into my relationship with my wife, she wasn't, we didn't quite get to the point of knowing I had Tourette syndrome at that stage. It was 7 years ago.
Okay.
So, as I was doing these things, she couldn't understand why I was doing them. So, she was trying to understand like, well, why was I always talking about pain? And
yeah. Do you get any sort of sense of relief when you vocalize your pain? Or, I mean, is there a benefit to doing it? Because I know, in some cases people will kind of have rituals along with their tics, and once they're able to kind of nail it properly, then they can move on for a little bit. But is there anything like that with you?
Yeah, I would say similar. It does sort of feel like a steam release, like I will have a lot of tension and just carrying my pain around all the time, and vocalizing it. It's almost like it's like my brain will scream, "This hurts, this hurts, this hurts," and then I say it out loud, and my brain is like, "Okay, it's been acknowledged. It hurts," and then it kind of will stop doing it for that thing for a while.
Does it have any impact on the pain at all? Or this may be a really dumb question, but.
And no question is a dumb question. I don't know that it has an impact on the pain, but it does help me to be able to kind of set it aside a little bit. Because until I acknowledge it, like my brain keeps cycling on it. Yeah. So it keeps it right front and center. Whereas once I vocalize it and say, oh man, that thing is really hurting today. Yeah. Then I'm able to kind of set it aside until my brain forces it back to the front, and then I'll vocalize it again, and then it goes away again. So more than anything, like it doesn't really change the pain levels, but it changes the focus, if that makes sense.
So, okay. So, I mean, you have a pretty broad spectrum of tics.
Oh, yeah.
Did your parents try to intervene in any way with medications or any kinds of therapies or anything like that? I mean, I know you said that it being pronounced as Tourette syndrome didn't come till later, but what was the sort of treatment like?
Honestly, I would say, my parents never treated me for anything. I actually was diagnosed with ADHD as a child, which I wasn't aware of. My father was actually not a very nice person. He was quite abusive. And there was a lot of belief that I was just a bad kid, and it just sort of went from there, which I think a lot of kids with these, not just Tourette syndrome, but ADHD, ADD, autism, anything like with a spectrum that might have behavioral differences. Back when I was growing up, they were just labeled as bad kids, and I was just a bad kid. So no, I didn't have any kind of medication. There was no help. And like I said, my dad was actually quite cruel. And, so it's interesting because, recently my mom and I have always been really close. So it's been an interesting thing to be able to kind of talk with her about some of the stuff, a little bit gently, but, so for example, with the ADHD, I only just started medicating that a couple of weeks ago. And I actually had a conversation with her. And I had a conversation with her about it. And that's when she said, oh, yeah, you were diagnosed with that as a kid. And I was like, oh, okay, well, why didn't you do anything? So, of course, it's a careful balance just with the abusiveness of my dad, right? That I don't want her to feel guilty that she didn't do enough because, as somebody in a pretty terrible home situation, I do understand that, she was in a really tough position. So yeah, there was no proper diagnosis for the Tourette's. I did get the ADHD diagnosis, but no treatment. And I was just labeled as a bad kid and pushed through the school system until I gave up and dropped out. And that was pretty much my belief, right?
So with the sort of phase theory from the doctor when you were young, I mean, how was it explained when your tics persisted, through your teens and so on?
That's a good question. Nobody after that initial, it's just a phase, ever came back to it. And then about 20 years ago, I had a child, and my child has Tourette syndrome.
Okay.
And so that was a bit of a glimpse. Now, he's got severe oppositional defiance disorder, and he has a lot of really tough stuff going on. And in fact, I would say like his challenges are pretty severe. Whereas mine aren't. I did choose to medicate him, and it did help. But as he got older, the severe oppositional defiance disorder then kind of flipped, and he didn't want to take the meds. And at that point, then it was, he was old enough. He was about 16. So then that became up to him at that point.
Is there anything in particular that seems to kind of set you off? Or, I mean, people say, quote unquote, trigger a tic, but anything like that?
Yeah, I do seem to have different triggers for my throat clearing and my eyes, where I squish them shut and roll them. There's quite a few different triggers for those. One, it seems to be any kind of emotional, I guess, a burst of emotion, whether it's good or bad, right? So stress, anxiety, anger, fear, happiness, excitement, all of those do seem to kind of trigger tics. And I don't know if it's just, the burst of different energy or what's happening. And I've also noticed for some reason that I tic more when I first sit down to eat.
Okay.
I have no idea what the connection there is, but it happens daily. Every single time I go to eat, I start with the eye tic and away it goes. And it's kind of that funny moment of, what is the connection there?
So does that kind of dissipate once you start eating?
Depending on the day, I'll often tic for a fair amount of time afterward as well, and then it typically will clear up. So yeah, it's kind of funny, and I do have some allergies and sinusitis, which also, of course, trigger the sniffing and throat clearing.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, like what can you do, right? Other than take a lot of allergy meds to try and reduce some of the sinus issues. But
yeah, that's what I'm trying right now. Actually, I went to the doctor. And he noticed my throat clearing when I wasn't conscious of the fact that I was doing it, but I was doing it every other second. And it kind of explained, it's like, well, I have Tourette syndrome. This may be a tic. I don't know. It may be a natural thing to do for practical reasons. Your body, everyday people, they clear their throat, right? But they recommended. I went and saw an allergist who recommended, and I actually have it here in my medicine cabinet still. But apparently it is like the Mac Daddy, so it's called Rupall, Rupall. Apparently they use it a lot in Europe. It has none of the same side effects that ours do, and apparently is magical. But at this time, I've chosen not to try it because I'm working through different medications right now for the ADHD and stuff, but you might want to consider that one. So yeah, I don't know what's available for you out there, but so have you tried any sort of medicines or medications for tics, or I mean, have they risen to the level to where you feel like you've had to medicate them, or kind of chosen a different course?
Yeah, I did go up and down on it over the last year and a half, but after doing a lot of research into the different medications, I sort of made the conscious decision of, I'm 42 years old. I've been dealing with my tics my whole life. And, some of the side effects scare me in the Tourette's medications. So I did actually make the conscious decision not to do it unless things got worse. I think the biggest thing why I would consider it, first of all, from annoying people around me, because, if you're sitting there clearing your throat for an hour and a half, people start to get a little bit irritated.
Right. Yeah.
But primarily, occasionally when I'm driving, if I'm doing my eye tick, especially if I'm having like a tick fit, where I have to pull off the side of the road, it's those kind of times where I'm like, okay, yeah, maybe it would be nice to medicate. But typically speaking, I can feel them coming on, and I'm pretty careful. If I need to, I'll pull over and all of that. So yeah, right now I'm not medicating that at all. But like I said, I did decide to medicate the ADHD about 2 weeks ago. I was taking some super stressful courses. So part of listening to your podcast and hearing everybody's stories and journeys actually made me a little bit braver.
Okay. Yeah, let's hear it.
So for 42 years, I've essentially tried my very best to hide that I had Tourette syndrome.
Yeah.
And, it's just allergies or et cetera. Right. Like I was just kind of the weird girl. And, after listening to everybody's journeys and, kind of, I think the ones that really spoke to me were the ones that were like, yeah, I tell people and I'm upfront about it. And like, it's totally awesome.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of Tourette communities on Facebook and stuff that I belong to as well. And there's some people in there that have gone that route. And it's really interesting to see like the difference that it's made in their world. So I sort of got brave and I decided that I was going to take a course that had a math prerequisite. Now, because of the dyscalculia and, a lot of trauma around math growing up, normally if I saw something had anything to do with math, I would run the other way. I decided, right? So at the time I decided, this is what I want to do and I'm not going to back down. So I enrolled and I picked up the math textbook and I was like terrified. And I started working through it. And I'm not going to lie, Ben, the first chapter had me pretty much hysterical, in tears and just like I could not function. Like I was just crazy lady. So then I realized in that moment, okay, there's no way I'm going to be able to push through 6 months of this. I need to do something different, not just for me, but also for my family, right? Because of course, my wife watching me go through this battle, it was hard for her to see me, upset and crying and, talking about being stupid. And like, I was really hard on myself. Part of what I learned from listening. Yeah.
I mean, I can do that to myself too. These challenges that you run into where it's just that they seem simple. People kind of do them with swagger, and I run into them, and I'm like, oh my God, like how is this? How are people fluent in this type of thing? Certain things seem like totally impenetrable to me, and I will kind of turn it in on myself, and that really, really kind of wrecks the confidence when it comes to being proud of the kind of thing you have and finding a way to say like, I'm as good as everybody else. And I mean, it's just, and what you were saying earlier about hearing people who did make the decision to just kind of be out about it and proud and saying like, I'm not going to let this, be a wall or this is not going to shut me down socially or professionally. I'm just going to own it. I had to hear that from people to kind of be okay and kind of march forward with it. I mean, that's what I was hoping to hear with this podcast, in addition to talking to people who were on the exact same level as I was, so we can kind of talk through it together. I mean, that's the biggest thing for me. But, and I'm sorry for cutting in like that. I mean, continue. No.
Yeah. It's just been really neat. So I did decide to face this head on. And when I realized that it was really, really not good mentally, the space that I was in, first of all, I found a therapist.
Okay.
No shame. I literally found a therapist to work with, and I told her very bluntly, I am having a lot of trauma and I need to work through this because I need to succeed. And, and so one of the things that I learned, a really simple tip to anybody out there who's got that really negative, crappy inner voice, saying yucky things at themselves, you can't do this, you're stupid, etc. The whole litany, right? Is to think about how you would respond to a child saying the same things about themselves. You would not say, oh yeah, you're totally stupid.
Right.
You would say, don't say that. You are smart. Or maybe your brain works differently, or like you would have compassion, right? And I think that we often lack that, especially if you have ADHD as a comorbid, right? Or OCD. Often there's a really kind of yucky negative voice that kind of lurks underneath, and nobody knows that it's going on because it's inside of you. So that learning to kind of open up to that, it was challenging, but I have been doing that. I call it, my inner child, working with my inner child. Through showing myself compassion, I was also able to forgive my father. And it doesn't excuse what he did, and it doesn't excuse the choices he made, et cetera. But what it does do for me is to be able to look at, his life, and maybe he's gone through something I don't really know. But the long and short of it was I was able to take a step back and look at him with compassion, which anybody who's gone through abuse, at the hands of somebody else, right. It's a really hard step to take. But I was able to look at him with compassion and think, like, what is his inner child doing? Because if his outer persona is this terrible, cruel person, like his inner child must just be, a terrible thing.
Oh God.
So I was able to kind of work with that, and there's a couple of different therapy things that we're working through, which are great. And then I got really, really brave, and I went to the college, and I said, "Hi, I have some learning challenges. I need help." Which I had never done before, and it was terrifying.
Well, so what was the sort of spark of that bravery? I mean, could you kind of think through it out loud to sort of what led you there? Or?
Yeah, knowing that for 40 years I have been so terrified of having people think I was stupid, or knowing I was going to fail, or all of these things always as roadblocks, that I would run away from the thing no matter what. So when I make up my mind, I'm going to do this thing, I want this thing, then it became about, crap, I'm failing at this. I need to change something. I can't keep hitting my head against the same wall 42 years later. So through listening to the podcast and kind of talking with people in the Tourette communities, I was able to kind of sit and take a deep breath and say, like, what's the worst thing? Okay, I'm admitting I have a learning disability. Okay, why is this so terrifying? Okay, I don't want people to think I'm stupid. Well, are people going to think I'm stupid for asking for the help that I need to be successful? Or are they going to think I'm stupid because I'm not doing the thing I want to do and I'm letting this fear hold me back?
Exactly.
I can tell you that all the best things I've ever experienced in life are from jumping off that cliff.
Right.
So that's what I did. I just made the decision of, I need to change what I'm doing or I'm going to have the same result.
I love it.
I mean, help.
So what happened?
Yeah. You know, at the school, I have never in my life met such an amazing bunch of people. So my math instructor was amazing. Amazing. I have never in my life had somebody understand me so well. If we tried one method for my brain to understand something and it didn't work, he would take a minute and think, okay, well, how can I alter this? And he would. And it was interesting because as we started the process, I did have meltdowns. I cried in front of him and I felt like a total tool for doing it, but he was gracious.
Oh, man.
You know, we're sitting in the library and I'm weeping like a 7-year-old, right? But what really became beautiful was I started to learn how my brain worked. I had never done that before because it was too scary. So it's interesting because I started to figure out, first of all, if you have dyscalculia and you are working on math, believe it or not, buy graph paper and use it, because it was like flipping a switch in my brain. Another thing is, for me, I have to use black ink on the graph paper. Otherwise, my brain somehow kind of mixes things up. And then the third neat thing that I learned was if I color code things, I picked up a cheap pack of pencil crayons. And while I was working on trigonometry, I would use colored pencil to highlight different angles, et cetera, on pyramids or triangles. So that as I was working through things, I could see them. And then for word problems, I figured out, okay, well, the first thing I need to do is write down, because as I'm reading it, my brain will mix it up. So I need to write down, what is the given information? Like, what's the important piece? What's the nugget?
Yeah.
So what do I know? What are they asking? What formula do I need to get there? Once I wrote those things down and I used the graph paper, I was able to actually follow the steps in a quite logical way, to the point that a lot of the struggles that I had previously had were gone. So then taking that and including this instructor that was patient and kind and human, and smart enough to be able to understand that if you tell me, do this, this, and this, and I'm like melting down, going, but I don't understand. Then he would come back to it and say, okay, wait a minute. So I think you're getting lost on this step. What if we tried this? Oh, yeah, I understand that. Okay, great. So let's ignore everything this textbook is telling you for the rest of this chapter and do what I just showed you. Oh, okay. And then I was fine. So through working with him, and then also I had a disability support person who kind of helped with me to figure out different ways to make flashcards and different things to study. It ended up being so much phenomenal support. And I really don't have enough words of gratitude for them. And they, I ended up having a team of about 5 people who were very closely invested in me, who were able to be really supportive. And knowing that I wasn't going to be able to complete the material fast enough, I took a challenge exam. And they don't tell you what your grade was. They just tell you whether or not it was good enough.
Okay.
So I went in, they put me in this little seclusion room, and I was in there. There were security cameras all over me, and I was like, okay. And I got in there and I wrote down all the formulas I needed to memorize, because once I would start writing, I knew I was going to get confused. So I wrote down multiplication tables, as silly as that sounds, at the age of 42. If you write them down once, you've got them correct, and you can just keep looking at them. Same thing with formulas, etc. So I got in, I wrote those down, I wrote the exam, and then when you're done, they tell you to go wait in a waiting room, and they'll come out in about 40 minutes. So I sat there for 40 minutes, just like, oh my God, I'm going to fail. I know I'm going to fail. Expect to fail, and the guy came out and he said, "You crushed it."
That's awesome. That is so cool.
So the whole nugget to that is, don't be afraid to ask for help. And I couldn't have done that if I wouldn't have kind of opened up to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it's communication. It's by doing that, by asking for help and finding ways to collaborate, you learn things about yourself and how you learn. You have these hurdles that you kind of victor over, and you have kind of like a new level of confidence, and certain things aren't going to bother you as much. I mean, that's one thing I've definitely had to learn about myself over the past year, just with basically learning that I can carry on kind of with the way I am. And after I've communicated with my, coworkers, friends, that sort of thing, the peculiarities don't really, I mean, they're not a thing anymore. They're not an issue. And I can just kind of carry on with what I feel like I'm good at. The stuff I'm not good at, whatever, I'm, maybe I'll put attention on it someday. But as far as my line of work and what I enjoy and all that, I mean, I can enjoy excelling when I feel confident that the other people around me don't think that I'm just some sort of, this is the brain trick I was playing on myself, where I'm like, God, they think I'm just such a weirdo, or I'm clearing my throat every 20 seconds, I'm annoying them, or that's just kind of vaporized. And I love hearing these kinds of stories, because there's so many commonalities to it. The more you hear it, the more it kind of feels like a solid piece of proof that other people can try. And it sounds so basic, but it's just so effective.
Well, and that's just it, right? And I think that's the biggest change for me. This is why I got the official diagnosis of Tourette syndrome. I wanted it on record. Yes, you have this, and okay. So it was a weird thing, because that was, I think, the first switch that got flipped was, yep, okay, it's officially on record as Tourette syndrome. Now what? And I very tentatively kind of stepped out, deciding who I was going to tell and this and that. And I remember this key moment. One of my employers, I can't remember the basic context around it, but essentially I had done something or made a noise or said something, and he kind of looked at me and laughed, and he said, well, at least you don't have Tourette's. And I kind of looked at him. I said, actually, I do have Tourette syndrome. And he was like, oh, well, yeah, but not that thing where you like yell and swear and stuff. And I kind of looked at him. And I kind of had that
exactly,
moment,
not that thing. Yeah.
And that was sort of the end of the road as far as my respect for him went. And it wasn't very long afterward that I changed jobs.
Yeah.
But because I was so new in the journey, I didn't feel confident enough to correct him and tell him like, hey, listen, that's really inappropriate. Whereas now I would, right? Like if I felt that somebody was, being disrespectful. And I feel like the way that he did that was absolutely disrespectful. I don't get triggered typically by people joking about Tourette syndrome, but I think that there's a line. If you're joking about somebody else or, doing it in a cruel way, then I am going to correct you. Yeah. If you are, somebody with Tourette's and you crack a joke about it, go hard, right? Like, because you have to find the humor in it, like seriously.
Oh yeah. Yeah. In anything. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's, but it's been neat because by opening up, so I've told, I have changed employment. I'm at a new office now. And, I'm selectively telling people, piece by piece. But I am, one of the first days, one of the partners of the business sits right across from me. So essentially he's like one of the head bosses. Yeah. And he sits across from me. And the one day I was actually clearing my throat fairly repetitively. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I think it was like my third or fourth day there. And I just kind of looked up at him and I said, I'm so sorry. If my throat clearing is bothering you, please let me know. I have Tourette syndrome and this is part of it. And he kind of looked at me and was like, oh, I didn't even notice. So,
right.
So, which also was that moment of, okay, well, maybe I'm being, a little bit hyper aware of what I'm doing, kind of, which is another thing I suspect probably a lot of us do, right? As we're kind of, occasionally we'll encounter somebody who gets really annoyed with our tics, and then we feel like everybody's going to feel the same way.
So is that generally how you do it and how you kind of break the ice where you feel like, these people have to be kind of wondering, I'm going to go ahead and explain to them? Or, I mean, what are the scenarios where you feel like it's the right time to say it?
I think you need to feel it out with your gut, right? Like you kind of know how the people around you are going to take it. So, for example, of the boss who was like, oh yeah, well, at least you don't have Tourette's. Then, for me, it was more in the moment I needed to correct him with, wait a minute, I actually do have Tourette's, and that wasn't okay. So I think that's it. And I also, I do carry a couple of printouts that I got. I think it was from the Tourette Association of America, or maybe it was one of the ones in the UK. One of them had some pretty good public service pamphlets. Right. And I keep those with me so that if somebody does have questions and I don't have time to answer, I can kind of say, well, here's a sheet for you.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So overall, though, I feel it out, right? So if I'm talking to a coworker, because of my facial tics and stuff and some of my vocal tics, talking with me occasionally can be awkward, or I feel like it can be awkward, right? Like I feel like I'm making faces and kind of being weird. So at that stage, then I'll feel it out like, okay, should I say something? Shouldn't I? There's like no one answer to that. It really just depends. I recently came out to my mother-in-law, in fact, like this weekend, which was a little bit terrifying. Yeah.
What happened?
We were strolling through a park, and I was talking about sensory processing disorder, which I also have. Okay. And she was like, well, what is that? Like, why do you have that? And then I said, well, actually, it comes along with Tourette syndrome, which I also have. And she was like, oh, so she asked a few questions, very basic, well, what is Tourette syndrome? And, and it was funny because as I explained, she's like, oh, that's what that is? Like, she didn't she had the common misconception Tourette syndrome is people yelling and swearing and da-da-da-da-da-da. So, she's like, well, what does it look like for you? So I said, well, you know how I clear my throat a lot? And she was like, yeah. I was like, yeah, that's my Tourette syndrome. Oh, so it was really weird, but it was good, right? Because now it opens up, okay, she's clearing her throat. She can't help it. That's, just part of what she's dealing with. And,
right.
So, I think it just really depends on the situation. Like, You have to feel comfortable. But I have found no matter when the moment is, it does seem to open up for questions, compassion, understanding,
Totally.
And making it normal, because I think a lot of us try so hard to hide our Tourette syndrome. We waste so much energy. We spend so much time kind of worried or stressed, or why do we do that? You don't hide it if you have cancer, or, why do we do this to ourselves? Okay.
Yeah, it's so exhausting, and it's kind of funny too, because on the other end, when people are maybe, and this may be just the scenario I've played out in my head of what people are wondering about me, but I always imagine that, and kind of looking back, is so much exertion on hiding it and masking it, and just finding ways to play off the tics like they didn't happen or it's normal, and then wondering what the other people think about me when they do observe my tics. Creates, I mean, it's just that hyper awareness. But then even on their end too, they may be trying to figure me out in a way that just totally goes off in the wrong direction, where just kind of the simple act of just talking for a minute, especially, I mean, with coworkers, at least in my case, I'm on good terms with all of them. And when it kind of got around, and I put the word out there, and some of them saw it on social media, and I mean, it was just instant, like, hey, that's awesome. It was just, it was as easy as that. And I know not everybody's had the same sort of level of experience, or the happen, the outcomes are different, depending on the sort of history people have with each other. But it's been nothing but positive for me, and it's funny thinking about it too. Shut me down on anything that's too personal, but how did this come up with your wife? Like, early on in the relationship, when you said, okay, this is why I make these sounds, or like, how did that come up?
Well, it's actually really funny, because at that time, no, I totally didn't vocalize it. I was clearing my throat one day, and I think it was driving her a little bit crazy. And she probably made a comment about, like, "Oh my God, can you take a drink?" or, something similar. And it kind of went down that road for quite a while. The funniest thing is, I think when we actually started talking about it, God, I'm almost embarrassed to admit this. We watched a junkie show. What the heck is it called? Darn it. It's the one where American people are bringing, people from other countries on visas. 90-Day Fiancé.
Yeah.
It's such a garbage show, but also it's one of those, it's like a train wreck, right? You have to watch it. It's kind of horrifying. But so on one of I think it was maybe the second season of that, there was a woman in there named Lauren, and she had Tourette syndrome. And, as I was watching it with my wife, we were watching Lauren tick and kind of talk about her Tourette syndrome a little bit. And, I watched how ashamed she was of it. And, at that time, her parents believed that it wasn't hereditary, because the potential in-laws were concerned that if they had kids, that it would potentially be passed down. And so they had a little bit of misinformation and said, no, it's totally not hereditary. But as we were watching the show, it was interesting, because, my wife would be watching Lauren's tics, and then she would kind of look at me.
Wait a minute.
And I'd be on the other half of the sofa ticking away. So I think that that probably started opening it up more than anything between my wife and I, and she's really amazing with it, honestly. Like, she jokes with me about it if I'm having a really kind of brutal roll of tics, or, she's super compassionate, super supportive. And, of course, occasionally my tics will bug her. So we still have those, those occasional moments where she's like, oh my God,
right.
Like, an hour into constant throat clearing, and of course she doesn't mean it in a yucky way, but of course, if somebody listening to it happening, like, yes, fair enough. And another one of the jokes is, because with my sensory processing disorder, so for that one, meat textures are really, really bad for me. And I want to say too, that anybody listening, if you have trouble with different types of fabric, different food textures, different sounds maybe trigger you, make you feel angry or upset. These could potentially be sensory processing disorder. And for me, I've always had it that if I try and eat certain types of meat, particularly dry meat, so like pork chop or chicken or that would actually cause me to gag, and I just couldn't do it. And then fabrics, touching jeans, even somebody else touching your jeans, like scratching or rubbing, will freak me out to the point I just can't handle it. Then there are voices that trigger me. So and I didn't really realize, I knew that they annoyed me, but I didn't know. Apparently I shoot them a really dirty look. Certain voices will trigger, and and I can't block it out. And it will actually make me feel almost irrationally angry, and it's just somebody's voice, right? But there are very specific kind of tones almost, and I don't really know what it does in my brain, but it actually does trigger anger. So that was part of it too, because, we'd be in a restaurant and somebody 3 tables behind me would be talking, and I couldn't block out their voice, and I'd just be getting irritated.
Man.
So, my wife would be like, okay, it's okay. Like, it's,
so is this, like misophonia? I mean, my better half, same thing. What you just described, fabric rustling, and I'm really bad about this. I'm really, really bad about this and I almost feel like it's almost one of my, I guess you could call it a tick or a ritual or something, but I'm always flattening my hands against my pants, then kind of like rubbing them back and forth. It drives her crazy. If we're at the movie theater and people are opening up, like candy, like the wrapper sound and all that, drives her crazy. And it will elicit like an actual, like a reaction from her, and will change her tone and change her mood. And we looked it up, and misophonia was the word that seemed to closely correspond with it. I don't know though. Don't know.
I haven't looked at that one, but I know for me that they, the sensory processing disorder, and the only reason I think that there's a difference, I do believe that there's a difference, like if it's only sound or if it's only texture, then there are different categories. So for me, because I experience multiple sensory issues,
makes sense.
Then it is sensory processing disorder, and it's stupid. Like the meat texture. I'm trying to think if I have any other food ones. I think it's primarily like meat, fish, poultry, etc.
Okay.
So I will actually, and sometimes it even happens with food I really love. So I might be digging into a big old bowl of whatever that I normally love and would enjoy eating, and I'll get 3 bites in and be like, oh no, I need to stop eating this thing right now.
Oh man.
Which really sucks. We'll go out for breakfast and they'll put something delicious in front of me. I'll get 3 bites in and just be like, oh no, this is not going to happen today. So it can be frustrating for sure. And a lot of kids with sensory processing disorder, seams on their socks. Now for me, sock wearing is torture. Even as, a 42-year adult, I can do it now.
Yeah.
But it's not a nice experience. Whereas, as a kid, it's much harder for them to kind of process that. They're starting to get smart and make seamless socks, or, parents can sometimes get away with, if it's a small seam, turning the sock inside out. But it is interesting, and I'm totally picturing you and your partner having kind of the back and forth of, oh my God, don't do that.
I apologize a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just kind of part of it, right? Same thing, right? I'm apologizing for the throat clearing and the vocalizations and the.
Well, it's funny too, because I apologize when I catch myself like making some sort of offensive sound that isn't a tick, maybe, and candy wrapper. But if I do, sometimes I will get in situations where I am kind of in a particular ticky moment, and whether it's throat clearing or whether it's I have this series of kind of minor sounding mouth sounds that I can disguise if I want to, if I'm in public. I don't care about doing that anymore, but that's one thing I used to apologize for all the time. And that's where she'd be like, why are you apologizing? Like, I don't care. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, just making sure. But
it's funny that we do that too, because really, like, people make noises and do things around us all day long that Like without Tourette syndrome, we're just annoying as heck. So, why do we apologize for doing something we can't really control, right?
Yeah. A lot of people do a lot of annoying things they can control. So
exactly. But it's interesting, so I'm curious, as you were talking about that, I actually had the curiosity. Do you ever have a tick that you didn't realize was a tick until you really thought about it? So for example, for me I read license plates out loud. I always notice them. It makes me crazy. Whether it's good or bad, it just is what it is, and I say them out loud. Yeah. And I started carpooling with my wife. When I took the new job, we actually only work a few blocks away from each other. So we carpool now, and we'll be driving, and I'll be doing that. And then she'll be like, I think that may be a tick of yours. And I'd be, what? Like, I just kind of thought it was something I did that was a little bit weird and annoying. But then, as I started thinking about it a bit more, I was like, oh yeah, I think that probably is a tick, because it's not that I'm intentionally doing it. I'm not really aware I'm doing it until I've done it or until somebody points it out. So then it's, oh, okay, well, maybe that is a tick. Do you ever have where you're not sure if it's a tick until somebody kind of points it out?
Yeah. So one thing I do, and I've done this my entire life, and I always just thought it was just me being, kind of a smart ass or something, but I will hear something or somebody says something in a certain way, and I would just immediately repeat it. And, I'm conscious of the fact that I do it, but I do it so often that it's kind of not my style, I guess. It doesn't seem like something that would jibe with my personality to just repeat every little quirky thing I hear out there. If someone says something on TV that has some kind of weird inflection or something, I'll repeat it. And so that's been pointed out to me a lot. And I was interviewing my grandmother. This is maybe, I don't know, about a year ago. But she brought up, and I forgot why she brought this up, but she said that when I was a little kid, I was maybe a couple of years old, but I was staying with her and my grandfather, and every single time he would say something or cough, or I would do my best to repeat it the exact same way. So I would cough right after him, or if he said something or if he laughed in a certain way, ha ha, I would do the exact same thing right after that. And I'm like, huh, so maybe, and I wasn't familiar with echolalia and so it's part of this has been kind of it's been the discovery thing where I'm like oh my god, that there's so many more layers than I thought about, and this is going to sound really stupid too, but I'm really, really bad at making the dumbest possible jokes that I can possibly think of, just stupid puns and anything that I can kind of turn inside out and make funny. I put funny in quotes somehow, and it drives my fiance crazy, I think. And I end up apologizing for it. I'm like, I'm sorry, that was so stupid. But I do it at every single opportunity to where I feel like maybe I do kind of want to do it just for the thrill of saying a stupid joke and kind of getting it out there and putting my flag on it. But it's to the extent where I'm like, I don't know if that's normal. I mean, is it really my personality to where I have a drive to do that, or is there some level of compulsion to it? And somebody may be listening to this, or a researcher or Tourette scientist may be listening to it and saying no, you're just not funny. But
I do the same thing though.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm always cracking puns and stupid jokes, and same thing, right? Is that my personality, or is that a tick?
Yeah.
And I'm curious now that I'm thinking about it. I'm like, maybe I need to pay attention to when I'm doing it. Is it when I'm stressed? Is it situational, or is it just all the time? It's interesting, but I am curious.
It's all the time with me. I think even when I'm, when I'm feeling down, it's just the opportunity crosses in front of me and I just seize it, especially if there's a song playing. I mean, this is some sort of Weird Al Yankovic kind of thing, but if there's a song playing and it seems like the lyrics are easily adaptable to something else, or they rhyme with something else that's happening around me, I will immediately do it.
Oh my God, I do that all the time. And I make up songs. I'll be walking around the house singing some weird song that I just invented.
Yeah, it happens all the time. And so this is not necessarily, I guess, in the realm of tics, but definitely things where I'm like, if once I examine them, I'm like, that's if I saw somebody else doing that, I would be like, oh God, it's just, but it's me. And I feel like there is some level of compulsion to it. The throat clearing thing, once my allergy doctor kind of pointed that out, I'm like, yeah, okay. So every single time I do it, I'm definitely becoming hyper conscious of how much I clear my throat when I'm at the office.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to kind of, develop a level of sorrow for my coworkers because we work in very tight quarters. And if I'm doing that all the time, and I know I am, then, and I do have allergies. I mean, there's some legitimacy to it, but I'm definitely questioning whether or not that's a tick at this point.
Yeah, it's funny as you're saying that. So again, I work in a really open office as well with about 50 other employees. So it's kind of funny. When I first started working there, the person that sits right beside me, he's actually my mentor. And he often also clears his throat, which is funny because it can trigger me. But anyway, if it's particularly bad, the one day he kind of whispered to me, I'll be right back. And he kind of left the room and, did what he needed to do when he came back. And I was like, well, where did you go? He's like, yeah, if it's really, like, if I need to clear my throat a lot or if I need to cough any, I go down into the server room. And I was like, oh, my God, that's brilliant.
Huh. Yeah.
And I think it was quite literally at that moment that I was like, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I have Tourette syndrome. Now, I knew him for a couple of years before working with him. I guess I should have clarified that. But I don't think that I ever told him about the Tourette syndrome. So I did say that I occasionally go and, I cough or I clear my throat. And he's like, oh, yeah, just go down to the server room. So, occasionally either him or I will get up and kind of run down to the server room and, go through a cycle and then come back and nobody's the wiser. So, you can kind of suppress it for, a couple of hours, go and have like a little tick sit in the quiet room and then come back out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what else? We've gone through so much. I mean, what haven't I asked about or what haven't we hit?
You know what? Honestly, I can't think of anything specific. I think it's more like as I'm thinking about it, the comorbids and the quirks and, I am curious, do you have any either self-harming or stim ticks? So for me, for example, I do have a stim tick where I touch my face a lot. I like the sensation. I'm not sure what about it. But then I also have, I think, like I already mentioned, ripping hangnails. I also will chew the inside of my cheeks until they're bleeding, which isn't good because I'm on blood thinners. To the point that actually the first time I went to see, I changed dentists probably about 8 years ago. And the first time I went in to see him, he was like, oh, you have a lot of scarring in your mouth. Like, what's going on with that? And at the time I was ashamed. So I was like, oh, I don't know. Like, I just kind of played stupid. But there have been times where I remember a phase when I lived out in Manitoba that I would actually chew on my bottom lip so much. I would have a fat lip. Like, we're talking Angelina Jolie's lips looked tiny comparatively.
Yeah.
So, and it's painful as hell. And I would love to be able to curb some of those, but I haven't figured out yet how to do it. I know some people say they can kind of redirect ticks. I have not yet figured out that magic.
Yeah. No, with me, so when you said chewing the inside of your cheek, and that's something I definitely used to do when I was a kid a lot. I would kind of pull my hair, but that's not really the same thing. I think when I was a kid, there was some hint of that that has not persisted into adulthood. But now that you say it, I'm going to have to start paying attention to myself because there may be some things I'm doing just that, because I'm discovering this kind of thing all the time. I mean, just new things I pick up about myself.
Yeah.
And it's not the same where it's like, I wonder if I'm doing this, and then my brain kind of manufactures a way where it's like, there it is. I do continue to learn these little quirks about myself and there's almost kind of I don't know if fun is the right word, but just enjoying kind of the discovery process of being like, God, I'm 38 years old. I'm not brand new to myself. I'm not brand new to the world, but I'm still kind of picking up things or at least finding ways to explain things that I've always kind of carried with me. And
like that aha moment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've had a lot of those.
That comes along with opening up to it. And I think that that's one of the things that I found really neat about this process is once I opened up to it, it was almost like it gave me permission to look into the weird things that I do and kind of debate, okay, well, could that be a tick? Or, like it changes how I interact with others. It changes how I interact with myself. And it has been a really interesting journey about getting to know myself and my Tourette's and my comorbids, right? I think I think you're spot on with that. It changes your relationship with yourself. And it's pretty powerful.
That, I think, is the perfect way to close out. I was visualizing it in my head, like the waveform on my computer screen when I'm editing is like, that's like the final word of this episode. that came out so well. I mean, that's exactly what I'm trying to get. So I get a lot of emails from parents of recently diagnosed kids, and they have they don't have any experience personally with Tourette syndrome, and they've looked things up, and it's just a world of confusion on the web. If you try, you can go down the wrong alley and run into bad information. And so I'll get these emails and like, what's his life going to be like? And there are people who've even asked, like, what's the life expectancy? And I'm like, that has nothing to do with it. Don't worry about that.
It's brutal. I've seen that too, where parents are like devastated by the diagnoses and what their child is going to go through. Or, even like I've heard so many doctors just, they'll tell the parent, your child will outgrow this. It's okay. And then these parents come into the forums with this misinformation, and they're patiently waiting. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, these poor kiddos. So if the parents are listening, number one, your child will be okay. Tourette syndrome is not a death sentence.
Right.
Embrace it. Learn as much as you can about it. Support your child as much as you can. Try not to get angry at the tics and the different comorbids, as hard as it may be. I know that a lot of them are really tough to manage, like the severe oppositional defiance disorder and stuff like that. And I understand all of that, absolutely. And I understand that, of course, every parent wants to have a perfect, healthy, happy child and blah, blah, blah. There is nothing stopping any child with Tourette syndrome or any of the comorbid things that are associated with it from living a fantastic life. You know what? They may have to work a little bit harder for some things. They may have to figure out how their brain works. And by supporting them and loving them for who they are, instead of waiting for it to get better, waiting for the cure, waiting for it to change, don't just hold on and wait. Embrace it. They're okay. They are okay with who they are, how they are, all the quirks, the tics, the things. Love them. That is the biggest thing. Love them, support them. They will find their path and they will be okay.
How's that for an ending? Jade has delivered. Thank you so much, Jade. Please keep in touch. And thanks to you, the listener, who hopefully is amped on sharing this episode and others like it with people who need to hear it. All past episodes at tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. Libsyn is spelled Libsyn. Of course, you can find it on all the popular podcast apps. And also, I'm sure I'm going to talk more about this soon, but I got a text yesterday from a new friend I met through this podcast, and he pointed out how there's such an amazing, energy right now behind Tourette syndrome. There's a lot going on, and it all feels good. Better portrayals on television, and of course you got Samuel J. Comroe, who's been nailing it on America's Got Talent, and so many great forces on YouTube and so on. I mean, there's a lot happening right now. A lot of pride in Tourette syndrome, and I don't want it to just be a quick wave that goes away. In fact, I would hate to see this energy left unrealized for the future. So keep it up. Keep the communication flowing. Hopefully the Facebook group is up and running without any problems, though Sophia has been on it, and I'm lucky she's administrating. Follow me on Twitter at Tourette'sPod, and I'll try to have updates there. And of course, you can also email me, tourettespodcast@gmail.com, with anything you want to talk about. I'd still love it if you'd record a voice memo on your phone and email it to me so I can play it on the show here. If you want to just type me an email, obviously, no big deal. Love that too. Anyway, we will close this one out and see you next week. Thanks again. This is Ben.